Most people remember Michael Jackson for the music, the moonwalk, and the spectacle. But the foods he reached for behind closed doors tell a different story. Some were comforting, some were unusual, and some were so unexpected that even those closest to him were caught off guard. These hidden meals reveal a side of Michael the public rarely saw, the quiet human side. Most of the world saw Michael Jackson through the shimmer of stage lights, magazine covers, and stadium screens. To many, he didn't feel like a person who lived an ordinary life at all. He floated in the imagination as a kind of mythic figure, someone who belonged to the world rather than to a home, a kitchen, or a quiet dining room. But the truth is more intimate. Behind the choreography, the cameras, and the endless pressure of fame, Michael lived a life made up of small habits, small rituals, and small comforts. And one of the clearest windows into that private world is the food he ate. What makes these meals so compelling isn't just that some of them were surprising, it's the story behind them. Michael grew up in a crowded house where dinner was quick but meaningful, where pots of stew and simple homemade dishes carried the warmth of family life. As he grew older, food became a way to stay grounded while the demands of touring, filming, and recording left almost no room for rest. In those rare, quiet moments, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes between rehearsals, he reached for meals that told the truth about who he was when no one was watching. Some dishes link back to his childhood, reminding him of days spent eating with his brothers between early rehearsals. Others came from the strict health routines he tried to maintain as he aged. A few choices were indulgent, strange, or outright shocking to the people around him because they didn't match the controlled, polished image fans imagined. These meals show a man trying to balance nostalgia, discipline, stress, and comfort inside a life that never slowed down. Each item on this list reveals a moment, a feeling, or a story. Some foods became symbols of his creativity, others became reminders of his exhaustion, and a handful were simply small joys he kept to himself. These aren't just dishes, they're glimpses into the rhythm of a life that was both extraordinary and incredibly human. They remind us that even someone who seemed larger than life still paused to sip soup on a quiet afternoon, still missed the flavor of a childhood favorite, and still found calm in the simplest meals. As we walk through these surprising dishes one by one, you'll see how food shaped small but meaningful parts of Michael's world. You'll see the nostalgia, the discipline, the unexpected choices, and the emotional weight behind meals that rarely make it into documentaries, but help us understand the man behind the legend. This is not the story of a superstar's diet. This is a collection of quiet moments, told through the meals that stayed with him. And together, they reveal a side of Michael Jackson most people never knew existed. Number 1, KFC Bucket Nights at Neverland. There's a moment people don't expect when they imagine the world's biggest pop star settling down for dinner. You picture a private chef preparing a dish with impossible ingredients, plated like fine art. But for Michael Jackson, some of his most comforting evenings at Neverland looked nothing like that. They began with something simple, a big red and white bucket of KFC. It might sound almost ordinary, but it ties back to a time before the fame, before the crowds, before the stages that lit up the world. In Gary, Indiana, fried chicken was one of the few meals the Jackson family could afford that felt special. It showed up on Sundays, birthdays, or nights when Joseph Jackson wanted everyone at the table at the same time. Those moments were rare. The Jackson home was loud, crowded, and built on discipline. But fried chicken created a small pause in all of it. Michael carried that memory with him for the rest of his life. By the time he owned Neverland Ranch, he had access to any food he wanted, prepared by chefs who had cooked for presidents and royalty. Still, he asked for KFC often, not in a silver bowl, not upgraded into a gourmet version, just the bucket, exactly the way he remembered it. Friends said it made him smile in a way that expensive meals never did. It was a small connection to the boy he used to be, the one who spent long afternoons practicing steps on the living room floor. But there was a part of it that surprised people around him. Michael didn't just eat the chicken, he ate a lot of it, especially during emotionally heavy periods. When work became overwhelming or public pressure reached its peak, he'd retreat into the familiar. For someone who spent most of his life being watched, judged, and picked apart, a meal that tasted like childhood was one of the few things that made him feel grounded again. His chefs would sometimes try to offer healthier alternatives, but he wasn't interested, not when he felt the weight of the world. The twist came from how private he was about these comfort meals. Fans imagined him dining in elegance, living on the kind of food only the elite can afford. Yet inside his own home, he was happiest breaking apart a drumstick and licking the seasoning off his fingers like any kid on a Sunday afternoon. And this wasn't the only surprising food habit he carried with him. Some weren't rooted in nostalgia at all. Some were quirks. Some were almost eccentric. And one of them involved a tiny bottle he kept on him everywhere he went, one that could turn any meal into something fiery. Number 2, the strange love for hot sauce on everything. People who worked with Michael Jackson long enough eventually noticed something unusual at the dinner table. No matter what meal was served, no matter how carefully it had been prepared, he always reached for the same thing: a tiny bottle, sometimes tucked in his pocket, sometimes carried by an assistant, sometimes already waiting for him at his place setting. It was hot sauce, and he used it on almost everything. The habit started early in his touring years, long before Neverland and long before private chefs. When the Jacksons were bouncing from city to city, catering wasn't glamorous. Meals were rushed, often bland and rarely fresh. Hot sauce became the quickest way to bring flavor back into food that tasted tired. Over time, it turned into something familiar and dependable. Even when the meals improved, the ritual stayed. By the time he became a global star, the contrast between his lifestyle and this tiny bottle was striking. The same man who performed for presidents and kings would sit down to a plate of grilled fish or a carefully balanced macrobiotic dish and drench it in heat. His chefs tried to adjust. They experimented with mild peppers, smoked peppers, exotic spice blends, and expensive imported sauces. But he didn't want anything fancy. He wanted the simple, store-brand kind he had used backstage as a teenager. Why it mattered is less about the sauce itself and more about what it gave him. Michael's life was built on precision. Every dance step had to land exactly right. Every note had to serve the story. Food was one of the few places where he could do something imperfect, spontaneous, and a little defiant. Hot sauce let him take control of a meal in a world where nearly everything else was decided for him. There was also an emotional edge to it. When he was nervous before rehearsal or drained after a long day of choreography, he'd add even more heat than usual. People close to him said it gave him a small jolt, almost like a wake-up call. Something about that burn cut through the stress. It wasn't just flavor, it was sensation. It reminded him he was still present, still in his body, still himself. The surprising twist came when guests or collaborators tried to match him. Most couldn't do it. He'd smile politely, warn them, and keep pouring anyway. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He simply liked what he liked. And for someone who spent his whole life trying to please the world, this was one of the few things he did entirely for himself. And his relationship with food only got more interesting from there. Some habits were playful. Some were tied to old memories. And one of them involved a bedtime ritual that reached all the way back to the days of the Jackson 5. Number 3, super sweet popcorn rituals before bed. If you ever stayed at Neverland long enough to see how Michael wound down at night, you'd notice a quiet ritual that seemed almost childlike. Before bed, he liked to settle in with a bowl of popcorn. Not movie theater popcorn, not the lightly salted kind chefs recommended. His version was different, sweeter, almost candied. and it traced back to moments that shaped him long before he became the king of pop. Growing up in the Jackson household, evenings were often the only time the brothers could breathe. After hours of rehearsals and schoolwork, they'd sit around the living room with whatever snacks they could find. Popcorn was cheap, quick to make, and stretched far enough to feed 7 boys. Sometimes Catherine Jackson sprinkled a little sugar over it to keep the peace, especially on nights when everyone was exhausted. For Michael, that small sweetness became a quiet comfort he carried with him for the rest of his life. When the tours began and hotel rooms replaced home, the popcorn routine became a grounding habit. He'd ask stagehands to find microwave popcorn late at night, no matter where in the world they were. He didn't want elaborate desserts or late night meals, just a bowl of sweet popcorn before sleep. It wasn't glamorous, but it reminded him of a different time when he and his brothers could put the world aside for a few minutes and just be kids. Later, when he owned Neverland Ranch, his chefs tried upgrading it. They used gourmet kernels, honey drizzles, vanilla sugar, and all kinds of premium touches. Michael appreciated the effort, but he kept drifting back to the simple style he grew up with: a bowl, some warm popcorn, and a handful of sugar mixed in by hand. The chefs eventually stopped trying to refine it. They realized the sweetness wasn't about flavor, it was about memory. The emotional twist came from why the ritual mattered. Nights were hard for him. They were the hours when the noise faded and the pressures of the day caught up. Popcorn became a way to soften that quiet, a gentle signal that work was done, rehearsals were over, and he could let the world slip away for a moment. Even at his peak, when millions were waiting for him to perform, he still liked to sit with that bowl the way he did as a boy on the couch in Gary. Guests who stayed at Neverland often found it surprising. They expected a superstar with extravagant tastes, not someone who ended his nights with a snack most people associate with childhood sleepovers. But that was part of Michael's puzzle. Beneath the fame and the spotlight, there were still pieces of the boy who once danced in his living room. And as we move through the foods that shaped him, not all of them were comforting. Some were things he forced himself to drink, even when he hated the taste, like the strange health potion that became part of his daily routine. Number 4, the health drink that tasted more like a potion. There was a moment almost everyone who worked close to Michael experienced at least once. He'd walk into the kitchen in the morning, still quiet from the night before, and his nutritionist or chef would slide a tall glass toward him. It wasn't juice. It wasn't a smoothie. It was a thick, pale mixture that looked more like something from a laboratory than a breakfast table. And he drank it because he was told he had to. The drink came from a turning point in his life. When the touring schedule grew heavier and the pressure built, his team realized he wasn't eating enough to keep up with the demands placed on him. He skipped meals, picked at food, or relied on snacks instead of real nutrients. Doctors stepped in and pushed for a structured plan. That plan included a daily health drink packed with vitamins, minerals, protein, supplements, and powdered ingredients he couldn't pronounce. He didn't love it. He didn't even like it. But he understood why it mattered. The taste was the part everyone remembered. Crew members joked that it smelled like chalk. Assistants said it reminded them of wet cardboard. Michael didn't argue. He'd hold his breath and take it down in a few long gulps, trying to get it over with. Some days he could finish it. Some days he set the glass aside with a half-forced smile, saying he'd try again later, even though he never did. What made this drink important was the role it played during some of the most intense periods of his career. When rehearsals stretched late into the night and he pushed himself harder than anyone expected, it helped keep him from hitting a wall. His team insisted he stick to it because his body was under constant strain. And despite how much he disliked the taste, he understood that the music he was trying to create demanded more from him than any normal lifestyle could support. The twist came in how this drink clashed with everything fans imagined about him. People pictured a star with access to gourmet meals crafted by top tier chefs. They imagined elegant plates, exotic ingredients, and perfect nutrition. Instead, he was often standing at the counter drinking something closer to a survival formula. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, it was practical. And for someone whose life was built on wonder and spectacle, this plain, unpleasant drink was a reminder of the real cost of staying on top. He rarely complained, but those close to him caught moments of quiet humor. He'd tease his nutritionist, asking whether anyone had actually tested the flavor before deciding it was safe. He'd swirl the glass and say it looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie, but he kept drinking it because he felt his body depended on it. And as strange as this health routine was, it wasn't the only unusual part of his diet. Some of his habits weren't based on nutrition at all, but on cravings that struck without warning, like the midnight meals that his chefs learned to prepare before he even asked. Number 5. The secret Mexican dishes he requested at midnight, approx of 400 to 550 words. If you worked in the Neverland kitchen, you knew that midnight didn't always mean the day was over. Sometimes, just when the house had gone quiet and the staff believed they were finally done, a voice on the intercom or a soft knock at the kitchen door would change everything. Michael was awake, and he wanted the same thing he'd asked for since the late 1980s: simple, home-style Mexican food. The habit began during the bad era, when he spent long nights in studios across Los Angeles. Mexican restaurants stayed open later than most places, so it became the easiest food to grab at the end of exhausting recording sessions. Tacos, quesadillas, rice with a little seasoning, nothing fancy, nothing heavy. The flavors were warm and grounding, and they helped him unwind after hours of high-energy work. When Neverland Ranch became his full-time home, he brought the craving with him. Chefs who worked for him said the pattern was almost predictable. If he had been rehearsing all day or writing new material, he wouldn't be hungry until late. Sometime around midnight, his appetite would suddenly kick in. He'd ask for soft chicken tacos, cheese quesadillas, refried beans, or Mexican-style rice with a bit of heat. And he liked it exactly the way he remembered from his studio days: simple, comforting, and easy to eat while relaxing. The reason this mattered was tied to his schedule and lifestyle. Michael lived in a world where daytime was rarely his own. Meetings, rehearsals, phone calls, and planning sessions filled every hour. Night was different. Night was his. It's when he wrote, designed, dreamed, and created. Midnight meals weren't just food. They were part of his rhythm. A quiet signal that creative hours were beginning. But the emotional twist came from how private he was about these cravings. Guests who visited Neverland imagined lavish nighttime spreads, trays of elegant hors d'oeuvres, or multi-course dinners prepared by top chefs. They never expected the king of pop to be curled up with a plate of warm quesadillas and a small bowl of rice. To him, these meals weren't a performance. They were comfort, a way to step out of the spotlight for a moment and just feel normal. The kitchen staff learned his preferences so well that they often prepared ingredients ahead of time. They kept tortillas ready, chicken seasoned gently, rice warm and soft. They even stored extra shredded cheese because they knew he liked it melted, but not too melted. If the request came, they wanted to be quick. And these late night meals say something important about him. Even with access to luxury, he found joy in the familiar. He didn't need extravagance. He needed warmth, simplicity, and the taste of a place that reminded him of long nights spent creating music that would change the world. But not all of his eating habits came from comfort or cravings. Some were shaped by guilt, discipline, and a deep connection to childhood memories, like the years when he tried to become fully vegetarian. Number 6. Vegetarian phases, fueled by childhood guilt, approximately 450 words. There were stretches in Michael Jackson's life when he pushed himself to follow a strict vegetarian diet, not because a doctor demanded it, not because it was trendy. It came from something quieter and more personal. People close to him said it started with a memory he couldn't shake, one that reached back to his early childhood in Gary, Indiana. As a kid, Michael loved animals with a kind of sincerity that never faded. He rescued strays, fed birds outside the house, and begged his mother to let him keep every creature he thought needed a home. But growing up in a working class family meant meals were practical, not sentimental. Chicken, pork, and beef were normal parts of everyday dinners. One day, according to stories he later shared, he saw a chicken being prepared for cooking and it left him unsettled. It wasn't dramatic, but it stayed with him. Years later, when he had the freedom to eat however he wanted, the guilt resurfaced. When he entered his 20s and 30s, he began taking vegetarianism seriously. He read about it, studied it, and experimented with different approaches. His chefs remembered entire months when he refused meat altogether. They made vegetable stir-fries, tofu dishes, hearty soups, and salads built to keep him full through long rehearsals. He wanted the meals to feel light but energizing, and he paid close attention to how his body responded. At times, he said he felt clearer, more focused, and less weighed down. Why it mattered goes deeper than nutrition. Michael was always searching for ways to protect the innocence he felt was slipping away. Whether he was building a zoo at Neverland, surrounding himself with toys, or creating spaces where children felt safe to play, he kept trying to preserve a gentleness he believed the world needed more of. Choosing not to eat meat, even temporarily, became part of that mission. It helped him feel aligned with the compassion he valued so much. But his vegetarian phases weren't perfect, and that's where the emotional twist appeared. Some days he stayed fully committed. Other days, old cravings crept back. Fried chicken, soul food from his childhood, or late-night tacos from his studio years would tempt him. He'd switch back and forth, sometimes overnight, leaving his chefs scrambling to adjust. They learned to prepare both options just in case. His diet didn't fit any strict label, and he didn't pretend it did. What mattered to him wasn't perfection, it was intention. Trying to live gently, trying to honor the animals he loved, trying to make choices that felt kinder, even if he didn't manage them every day. And still, even during these vegetarian stretches, he had one habit that completely contradicted the idea of clean eating. A snack so unusual that most people who tried it once never tried it again. It was his personal mix, thrown together for long studio hours and late-night creative marathons. Number 7, the odd snack mix he made for long studio sessions, approx 400 to 550 words. If you ever stepped inside a studio while Michael was deep in a creative run, you'd notice things other artists didn't require. He liked the lights low, the room cool, and the space almost silent, except for the music. But on the table beside him, there was almost always the same thing. A bowl of a snack mix that looked strange to everyone except him. It started during the off-the-wall sessions, when long nights became normal and quick bites were the only way to keep energy up. Instead of ordering meals or stepping away for breaks, he grabbed whatever was nearby. Over time, he blended sweet snacks with salty ones, then added crunchy pieces, then soft ones. Eventually, a pattern formed. He stuck with it, even when people teased him about the odd combination. The mix usually included plain popcorn, M&Ms, roasted nuts, dried fruit, and sometimes small pretzel sticks. But the most surprising part was a handful of gummy candies scattered throughout. Most people found the texture clash confusing. He loved it. The sweetness helped him stay upbeat. The salty pieces kept him from getting sleepy, and the gummies were a tiny spark of childhood in a room where the pressure to be perfect never really stopped. Why this mattered ties back to how he worked. His recording sessions were legendary for their intensity. Michael didn't just walk into a booth and sing. He danced while recording. He rehearsed for hours before stepping up to the mic. He pushed for take after take until every note felt alive. Meals didn't fit into that rhythm, but snacking did. The emotional twist came from how this mix mirrored his personality. He lived in contradictions. He was a grown man carrying the weight of expectations no one else could imagine, yet he clung to touches of innocence wherever he could find them. The snack mix became one of those small, comforting things that kept him tethered to a feeling of playfulness. Even at 3 in the morning, when producers were exhausted and the studio air felt heavy, one handful of his mix could make him smile. People around him learned not to question it. Engineers kept extra ingredients nearby. Assistants refilled the bowl without being asked. And no matter how big the project was, thriller, bad, dangerous, the mix stayed the same. But that doesn't mean he always ate freely. There were periods when the pressure became overwhelming and his appetite nearly disappeared. Those were the times when even this strange snack bowl sat untouched, replaced by meals so plain they barely counted as meals at all. Number 8. The overly plain meals he ate during stress, approx 400 to 550 words. There were times in Michael Jackson's life when the spotlight grew too bright, the deadlines grew too tight, and every hour felt heavier than the one before. During those stretches, his relationship with food changed completely. The cravings, the sweet popcorn, the studio snacks, those disappeared. Instead, he narrowed his meals down to the barest essentials. Plain foods, soft foods, almost flavorless foods. People who worked around him noticed the shift immediately. His chefs would prepare full menus, hoping to tempt him with something comforting or nutritious. But on stressful days, he'd push most of it aside. What he asked for instead was simple: steamed vegetables with no seasoning, a small bowl of rice, toast with nothing on it, or sometimes plain oatmeal. Meals that looked more like something you'd eat when you were sick, not when you were gearing up for history-making performances. This habit began during the Thriller years. The pressure to follow up his earlier success weighed on him in ways few people understood. He was rehearsing nonstop, recording late into the night, and planning visuals that would change music forever. During these periods, even the smell of rich foods bothered him. Plain meals became his way of staying calm. His team later realized these foods didn't just settle his stomach, they settled his nerves. Why this mattered goes beyond diet. Michael lived a life where perfection wasn't optional. Every song, every dance step, every public appearance was framed as a moment the world would judge. When things intensified, he turned inward. Plain food gave him something predictable, something neutral, something that didn't demand anything from him. It was a small place of quiet in a career built on noise. The emotional twist came from how misunderstood this pattern was. Outsiders saw the plates and assumed he was being dramatic or overly strict. But people close to him knew the truth. These meals weren't about discipline or image. They were about coping. When interviews piled up, when rehearsals became physically draining, when negative headlines appeared, he retreated to the softest, most uncomplicated foods possible. There were nights when he barely ate at all. Chefs would find half-finished bowls sitting untouched. Assistants would encourage him to try something more substantial, but he'd give a small, tired smile and insist he wasn't hungry. Fans saw the performances and felt the magic. They rarely saw the quiet kitchen where he sat with a plate of plain vegetables, trying to steady himself before the next day began. And yet, even during these periods of simplicity, one thing never disappeared: his love for sweets. He hid them. He tucked them away in places no one else knew about. And those hidden stashes became one of the most surprising food habits he ever had. Number 9, candy stashes hidden around his homes, approximately 400 to 550 words. Anyone who spent time at Neverland or any of Michael's other homes eventually heard the same rumor. Somewhere behind a cushion, inside a drawer, beneath a stack of books, or tucked into a corner no one ever thought to check, there was candy, not displayed, not shared, hidden, and not just a piece or two, little stashes scattered everywhere. This habit dated back to his early years with the Jackson 5. When the family was constantly rehearsing, touring, and recording, snacks became a kind of currency. With so many brothers around, treats disappeared fast. Michael learned early that if you wanted to save something sweet for later, you hid it, sometimes under his bed, sometimes in coat pockets, sometimes in spots even his brothers never discovered. When he grew up, became famous, and lived in enormous homes, the habit never left. Neverland made it even easier. There were rooms filled with toys, rooms for music, rooms for guests, rooms for animals, and hallways that stretched longer than some people's entire houses. Michael turned the place into a treasure map. Behind the pillows in his private theater, he stored chocolate bars. In the drawers of his library, he hid hard candies. Staff later said that while cleaning, they would find lollipops tucked into strange corners. Small, colorful secrets he left behind without a word. Why it mattered has less to do with sugar and more to do with what those hidden snacks meant to him. Michael's life was watched from every direction. Every decision became a headline. Every moment in public felt scrutinized. Candy gave him a quiet thrill that no one else controlled. It was a tiny way to hold on to privacy and playfulness in a world where both were rare for him. The emotional twist came from how protective he was of those stashes. He didn't mind sharing food at the table, but his hidden candy was different. Some friends recalled him laughing when someone accidentally discovered a stash, but most said he'd quickly move it or build a new one somewhere else. It wasn't about greed, it was about having something that belonged only to him. Even as he took health seriously, even during his vegetarian phases or the times when stress made him eat almost nothing, the candy stashes didn't go away. They waited quietly around the house, offering him a small indulgence whenever he needed to lighten the mood. Just a piece or two. Just enough to feel like the boy who used to sneak sweets past his brothers. And while candy was a hidden joy, some of his food habits were surprisingly straightforward. Things that seemed almost ordinary until you realized how often they appeared in his life. One example was a simple sandwich that became a post-performance tradition. Number 10. His unexpected obsession with fish sandwiches, approximately 400 to 550 words. For someone surrounded by chefs trained all over the world, Michael Jackson had a habit that seemed almost out of place in a house like Neverland. After long rehearsals or big performances, he often asked for something surprisingly ordinary, a fish sandwich. Not gourmet sea bass on artisan bread, not a finely plated whitefish with herbs. He wanted the kind you'd find at a fast food drive-thru or a simple diner, crispy, warm, a little greasy, and wrapped in paper. This craving went back decades. During his early touring years, fast food stops were often the only meals the Jackson 5 had time for between interviews, shows, and travel. Michael was sensitive to many heavy foods, but fish sandwiches felt lighter to him. They gave him fuel without slowing him down. By the time he became a solo star, the association stuck. A fish sandwich meant comfort. It meant routine. It meant something he understood in a life that kept changing. The tradition became more pronounced during the bad and dangerous eras. After finishing a performance that drained every ounce of energy, he didn't want a full dinner. His throat was tired, his body was sore, and he needed something easy. Staff members remembered him slipping quietly into the kitchen late at night, still wearing a bit of stage makeup, asking if there were any fish sandwiches left over or if someone could make one quickly. Why it mattered has more to do with what he felt after performing. Michael never walked off stage casually. He left parts of himself there. The adrenaline didn't fade right away, but the exhaustion hit fast once it did. A fish sandwich became a transitional ritual. It helped him come down from the high, settle back into reality, and remind himself he was just a person again. The emotional twist came from how specific he was about it. He didn't want too much sauce. He didn't want fancy bread. He didn't want anyone to improve it. He wanted the simple version, the one that felt familiar. Sometimes he even asked for two, one to eat right away and one to save for later. His chefs learned not to question it. They kept the ingredients ready in case he needed it after a long recording session or a demanding rehearsal. Visitors who expected luxury found this habit almost unbelievable. They imagined tables laid with expensive dishes or chefs preparing late-night meals with gourmet flair. Instead, they'd see Michael sitting quietly with a sandwich wrapped in paper, taking slow bites like someone savoring a long-lost comfort. And while this was one of his down-to-earth food choices, not all of them were simple. Some leaned into fun, nostalgia, and creative freedom, especially when he gathered his closest friends for a meal that sounded like something from a childhood sleepover rather than the home of a global icon. When you look back at these meals, it becomes clear that food played a far more personal role in Michael Jackson's life than most people ever realized. Behind the global icon was a man who leaned on certain flavors for comfort, for energy, for nostalgia, and occasionally for escape. Some dishes carried the warmth of his childhood. Others were chosen out of necessity as he tried to navigate long nights and heavy schedules. And a handful were simply small indulgences he allowed himself when the world outside felt too demanding. What makes these moments meaningful is not the food itself, but what the food reveals. The quiet midnight chili, the carefully prepared vegetarian dishes, the strange little snacks that staff members never expected him to enjoy. They show a side of Michael that doesn't exist in the spotlight. They show the human being who got hungry, who craved warmth, who felt tired, who missed home, and who found ways to remind himself of where he came from. For someone who spent decades being treated as something other than ordinary, these meals were one of the few places where life still felt simple. There's also something deeply touching about how understated many of these favorites were. They weren't extravagant or theatrical. They weren't made for show. They were the kinds of meals you'd find in any household trying to get through a long week. That's part of what makes them so telling. They remind us that even in a life filled with spectacle, the small, familiar comforts still held meaning. As you step back from this list, the picture that forms isn't one of a celebrity with strange habits, but of a man who tried over and over to create moments of normalcy inside a life that was anything but normal. These dishes help explain his routines, his late nights, his bursts of creativity, and even his vulnerabilities. They bring him closer, not as a legend, but as a person navigating pressure, memory, and exhaustion in the only ways he could. And that's the value of looking at stories like these. Food has a way of revealing the parts of a person that interviews, performances, and headlines can't capture. It tells us what mattered. It tells us what comforted them. It tells us what they missed, what they held on to, and what they tried to recreate when everything felt overwhelming. In the end, these meals don't just show us what Michael Jackson ate. They show us how he lived, what he valued, and how he found small pieces of peace inside a life that rarely allowed him to slow down. They invite us to see the man behind the legacy, not through the music, the tours, or the fame, but through the simple, quiet moments that made him feel human.